Ethan Kross, welcome to the Next Big Idea podcast.
I've been looking forward to this discussion for a long time. Thanks for having me.
Well, you've written a book about the voices in our heads, which is something you've been studying for decades. In theory, this might make you an expert in controlling these voices. But you open the book with a story of a time that the voices in your head got out of control. Do you want to share with us that story?
Yeah, happy to. So a little over a decade ago, I had published a paper with my colleagues that had gotten some national attention. I had gone on TV, and this was a very exciting moment. You know, my mom finally was proud, right? Here I go. And a couple of days later, I showed up in my office, and there was a really unpleasant, threatening letter in my mailbox, the kind of letter that, led me to have to file a police report and things of that sort. And it was nothing I had ever experienced before. And I really entered a state of terror, of real fear. My wife and I had just had our first child. And, when I went to the police, they gave me this very reassuring advice things will probably be fine. Just make sure that you drive home a different way from work each day in case someone's following you. Rufus, you have to understand, I live 4 blocks away from my office. So, you do the permutation.
There are only so many ways to get home. This is not reassuring at all. Yeah.
There are only so many ways. And so for a few nights, I regressed into adolescent protective mode and got my Little League baseball bat and stood guard downstairs, pacing the house, making sure no one was coming to get us. And so, chatter, which I talk about in the book, the kind of when your thoughts take hold of you rather than the other way around, it certainly struck for a couple of days, and it wasn't pleasant. And I will say this. We'll probably talk about how I got out of it in a little bit, but yes, I run a lab on self-control and emotion. And yes, I've been studying these voices in our head and how to control them for the past 20 years. I think I do know a little bit about it, but that doesn't mean I'm perfect at doing it. One of the things we've learned in the course of our research is that a truism of the human condition is that we are much better at advising others than we are following that advice ourselves. Yeah. And I think that experience I had a little over 10 years ago was a perfect illustration of that. Even though there were tools I was aware of, I was temporarily blinded to them during that moment. So that was my chatter baseball bat experience.
The term chatter, is that a term that you came up with? Is it a technical term? And what exactly does it refer to?
It's a term that's often used colloquially that I think immediately resonates with lots of people in the informal pilot testing that I did when working on the book. Psychologists are exceptionally gifted in many regards, amongst them using very technical words to describe very similar things and drawing lots of distinctions. And so we often use the word rumination to talk about when we get lost in thought about the past and perseverate. We use the term worry to describe getting lost in thought and perseverating about the future and things that we're concerned about there. The common thread is this perseverative negative cognition, which I think for me and many others, the way that manifests is in this mental noise, this chatter that we have trouble silencing. And so that's why I use that phrase to really capture the full terrain of verbal experiences that can get us into trouble, worrying about the future, ruminating about the past.
When you think about it, I mean, just the fact that we talk to ourselves is not to be taken for granted. I mean, it's kind of weird when you step back and think about it, that we have this little voice that we either engage with or ignore, and it carries on its own. How do you think this evolved, and what benefit what benefit does our inner voice give our species?
Well, I think the inner voice is in some ways a superpower, right? So what we're talking about in technical terms with the inner voice is the ability to silently use language to do things in our lives, and we use language silently to do many different things. At one end of the spectrum, You have the common experience that people often see in the movies, which I think is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about the voice in your head, which is that running commentary or monologue, in some cases a dialogue that we have with ourselves when we're trying to figure out our problems. And I think that experience rings true to many of us a lot of the time. We go over our experiences to try to problem solve, and language is a tool that can help us do it, right? We experience events and then we try to create stories to explain our experiences, stories that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that end is so critically important when it comes to negative experiences, right? Because oftentimes when we don't have explanations for things, an end to a story, we keep on struggling to find those explanations. So language and the inner voice helps us do it. But it also helps us do lots of other things that I don't think people are often aware of. Take, for example, if I were to present to you a string of numbers, like a phone number, and I asked you to memorize it, to verbally rehearse it, like language, the inner voice helps you do it. I'm repeating a number in my head right now. 209, the beginning of my childhood phone number. So the inner voice is part of a mental system that we call working memory, which is a basic feature of the human mind, right? It's our ability to keep information active in our head using words. The inner voice helps us do it. It also helps us do things like control ourselves. So oftentimes people report coaching themselves through a problem using words, using language on a difficult problem. So for me, difficult problems often take the form of having to put together new toys for my kids. I may be great with my fingers on the keyboard, but not so good when it comes to actual like instructions and tools. I have a knack for there always being parts left over, which doesn't always work too well. But okay, put the screw here, then turn the dial. I'll walk myself through the process. Language helps us do it. It also helps us do things like plan for the future and simulate. So before giving a big talk, I'll go over what I'm going to say in my head. Then I'll actually hear what the obnoxious audience member is going to ask me, and then I'll rehearse what I'm going to say back. Now, typically the first thing that I rehearse saying back, I would never say in person because it's ugly, right? I mean, it's aggressive. Then I do the real thing. So it's a tool for planning and simulating. So, we've gone over 4 different functions the inner voice serves. I like to think of it as like a Swiss Army knife of the mind. It helps us do lots of things that are central to our ability to navigate this world optimally.
And to me, the crazy thing is that it doesn't stop. It's involuntary, And you say at one point in the book that we spend a third to half of our lives living in the past or the present. And you say, we develop the ability to keep our inner worlds pulsing with thoughts and imaginings fueled by the inner voice. And I thought the word pulsing was an interesting choice there. And it made me think that this is almost like a cardiovascular system for the brain. I mean, years ago, I had one of my children say, "Daddy, if you don't give me that ice cream, I'm going to hold my breath until I die." And I said, "Well, you might be able to hold your breath until you pass out, but then your autonomic nervous system will take over and you'll resume breathing." But so I'm not sure that's going to work. But but thinking is like breathing in the sense that you can do it consciously, but as soon as you stop doing it consciously, you begin doing it unconsciously. And it almost seems like, the wild conclusion here is that this process we go through of learning, of running these simulations, of thinking about the past, of thinking about the future, that we learn from past mistakes and plan for the future to such a constant degree it can drive us bananas. But this clearly must have been an evolutionary advantage, right? To have this kind of constant stream of kind of contemplating the possible consequences of our actions and what we can learn from the past.
Yeah, well, I think it's a tool, and the thing to keep in mind about tools are only useful if you use them properly, right? And so this ability to travel in time in our minds, as you're describing, to plan for the future, to learn from the past, to maybe just to savor a great moment, or to fantasize. Like, I'm traveling a lot nowadays, right? COVID, I'm thinking about the next vacation, pina coladas on the beach, hugs with people, all that good stuff. Like, I'm strategically using my mind to feel better, right? But tools can also be harmful. Like, they can be used improperly. Like, I often use the analogy of a hammer, right? Like, a hammer in the right hands can create, like, it built my house, right? But in the wrong hands, a hammer can be a destructive force, right? If you wield it too strongly, or if you use a hammer to pound a screw, like, so we have this tool, and we don't necessarily have a user's manual that we were born with, right, for how to use it. Culture gives us some information about how to use this tool. And I think that's what my dad was doing for me, right? Like,
Yeah.
he absorbed from other sources, from the books that he was reading. Here's how he thinks it should be used. And he's passing down that knowledge to me. But the quality of that information, I think, was somewhat crude, anecdotal. What's super cool about taking science and applying it to this domain is now we're using science to make sense of how this tool works, when to use it, how to use it. And that, I think, is super fascinating.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned culture and the ways that culture can assist our ability to use this tool effectively. Because right now we're in a moment in history where there's a lot of focus on mindfulness, being present in the moment, um, and at the same time, as you've said, the ability to time travel is a superpower of sorts. I mean, this ability to improve on our past failures and strategize for the future. Do you think, is there some sense in which an obsession with being in the present moment is trying to run against the grain of human nature?
I think it can be taken too far. So I'm a big fan of working within the architecture of the mind. That is, as you said, we don't want to go too far against the grain, because that's not how we're built. So I think being in the moment and mindfulness is great. There's fantastic data showing that mindfulness can have enormous benefits. But you do see, I think, in popular culture, the idea of being in the moment taken too far, taken to a point that I think is, quite frankly, unattainable. That is, we should strive to always be in the moment. I don't think that is a prescription that we want to give to everyone, because I think there can be great value in being able to go back in time and forward in time in the way we've been describing. So I think the challenge that we all face is figuring out how to traverse time, whether it be going back or forward or being in the moment, how to traverse time optimally given the demands of the situation and what we want to do. Look, when I'm playing, what do I play nowadays? Oh, when I'm doing my high intensity interval training, I want to be in the moment, right? I need to be focusing on the activity and the movement. I don't want to mess up. I can hurt myself. But in other times, I want to be able to travel back in time without getting stuck. And that, I think, is the key. The key is not to shut off time travel altogether, because there's a risk that you may ruminate and feel worse. It's, how do we figure out how to go back in time or forward effectively? And I think science has a lot to say about how to do that.
It is ironic when you think that there may have been a point in our evolutionary history where we always were in the moment, right? There may be other species that cognitively are always in the present moment, right? But I mean, we don't know. This is hypothetical. But the current aspiration to always be in the present moment is somewhat ironic in that sense. But it's turning to something more fundamental. You say in the book, our verbal stream plays an indispensable role in the creation of ourselves. And so there's also this sense in which, right, this inner voice is really central, right, to our identity. Meanwhile, neuroscientists sometimes talk about the notion that the self is a construct, that in fact we contain multitudes, as Walt Whitman said, although I think he meant something else. I don't think you address this directly in the book, but I'm curious to get your take. Is the sense of a unified self that our inner voice is creating and constantly narrating everything that happens around us, to some degree, is that a fraudulent sense of a coherent, singular self that the inner voice is creating?
No, I don't think it's a fraudulent sense. I think it's a human sense of who we are.
Yeah.
So in the sense that I do agree that the self is a construction. We are constantly interpreting our experiences through different lenses, and those interpretations shape how we think about who we are. And language plays a role in helping us do that. Like, after a positive or negative experience, I go over it in my head, and I think about often using language, like how I reacted and what does that say about me? What does that say about that person? And all that information is contributing to our sense of who we are. So, and that doesn't mean, by the way, that we're one person. The self is complex. There's Ethan as professor. There's Ethan as dad. There's Ethan as husband. There's now Ethan as author. That self is still forming, by the way, very, very nascent, right? And so, but language is involved in helping shape those identities. And in fact, I tell the story in Chatter about a neuroanatomist who has a stroke that knocks out some of her parts of her brain that are involved in language. And initially she describes this as a euphoric experience. Finally, the voices in my head are silenced. No more worry, no more rumination. But what else happened? She stopped being able to plan and think about the future. And even more impactful, she lost her sense of who she was, because that stream, that verbal stream that was so helpful in allowing her to make sense of her experiences, went away. And she described that as very unsettling and uncomfortable. So words are powerful, not simply because they help us communicate with other people, but words play a role in, I think, influencing how we communicate with ourselves and how we think about ourselves.
It is extraordinary that we think in words, and it's almost the water in which we swim, mentally, right? I mean, we exist in this universe of words. I love the study that the British anthropologist, I think he was, Andrew Irving, did, that you write about, where he had New Yorkers speak their inner monologues into a tape recorder walking down the street, which is kind of a wonderful thing to visualize. I love that he asked them to do this. And I love that 100 people actually did it, right? I mean, this is, you got to love the New Yorkers who did that. That really feels a lot like what my inner voice feels like at times, just caroming around between different subjects, right? What did we learn from that exercise, from that study?
Well, first of all, hats off to Andrew Irving. What an amazing and creative idea he had to do this. So what did we learn? We learned that we actually see a really nice validation of some of the experimental work on this topic, where, number one, people's ideas are flitting back and forth between different content, like you're describing, like cancer, but then, I think staples, and oh my God, there's a seat here. So we are constantly updating what we're saying to ourselves based on how we navigate the world. But what was also really interesting is that across the participants, Irving reported that the majority of their thoughts focused on negative content. And I think that's really interesting, right? Because if you think about the inner voice as a tool, it's being wielded often to make sense of experiences that we're having trouble understanding or processing, which is often, I think, negative experiences. Like, some would argue that we navigate the world on autopilot, right? We have only so much attention that we can devote at any given time to something. So we've evolved in a way that we should conserve that attention and just effortlessly, live our lives. But we stop at times. And one of the places we stop is when we experience things that don't compute. that are that we don't have a mental structure to understand. And finding out that your best friend has cancer is that kind of experience, or being rejected by someone else, or being told that you're a bad driver or whatever else might make you angry. Like, these are experiences, these negative events get us to stop and pay attention. And our inner voice often perks up when that happens to help us make sense of the situation. So this brings up another point that I do want to emphasize, which is negative thoughts, like thinking negative things and an inner voice that's filled with negative content. That's not a bad thing in and of itself. I think another place, another message we often hear is try to strive for positivity all the time. No. Negativity in small doses is a good thing. We evolved the ability to experience negative emotions for a reason. So, I tell people I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy the ability to not experience negative emotions. What's problematic is when those negative thoughts end up unraveling into chatter, which are the negative thought loops, where it's not my friend has cancer, how am I going to help her and move on? And then you come up with an answer. It's my friend has cancer. What if she dies? What if I have cancer? What if my partner gets cancer? What am I going to... that captures the kind of cyclical nature of chatter that can be quite destructive.
Yeah, when the record starts to skip and we get stuck in what I think of as the shampoo cycle, lather, rinse, repeat, lather, rinse, repeat, I think is like a programming tech term for it, right? But it's and I think we've all experienced that. And among other things, it just consumes valuable time and energy, right? To just be running the same script again and again. But we run that script insanely fast. I think probably the single most astonishing assertion in your book is the idea that our inner voice speaks at 4,000 words per minute, right? Which is just mind-bogglingly fast. I mean, there are lots of things I'm really lousy at. I consider parallel parking and typing to be two of my strengths, Ethan. And I like to think I type at about 100 words a minute, which I think of as almost as fast as I'm thinking, stuff that I'm writing. But this is 40 times faster than that, right? This is just insanely fast, right? Which, as you point out, this is a State of the Union address every minute, which leads me to two questions. The first is, are you sure? I mean, could they actually confirm this rate, right? I got all the way into your appendix to get into the notes of where that study came from. And second, are we really listening to all those words that we're saying to ourselves?
Right. So am I sure? You better believe I checked that reference 40,000 times just to make sure. So I found it astonishing too when I came across it. So a couple of just, let's put that statistic in perspective and try to help us understand how that's possible. So number one, so we could think much quicker than we can speak. For one, we don't have to activate the motor processes that are involved in actually talking, right? Like the mouth movements, lifting our diaphragm. So that strips away some time. That's still not going to get us to 4,000 words a minute though, right? So how do we get there? Well, we can think, and we often do think, in a compressed form, right? So we're not thinking in full sentences. We're thinking oftentimes in the equivalent to how we might take shorthand notes. And that gives us the ability to think at a much faster speed. We don't always think at 4,000 words a minute. We can, according to the study that I cited there, right? Like solve verbal problems that quickly. Mm-hmm. We can certainly slow down the pace. And I don't know of studies that have compared different types of silent verbal problem solving, but I would imagine if you're telling a story about yourself in full sentences, you would speak less quickly. But it certainly speaks to the upper bounds of how quickly we can talk to ourselves, and that's I think one of the it's a mind blower to me that we can think that fast. It speaks to, I think, what is often experienced as the frenzied nature of inner self-talk. Right? We often feel like our thoughts are pinging really, really loud and fast, and they're uncontrollable. That's a description that many people often provide when they're experiencing chatter. Like we feel like our thoughts are just running, and we can't slow them down. And so yeah, it is remarkable. What was the second part? Did I answer the second part of your question?
Are we always listening? Are we always listening? I guess
Yeah.
this would be the distinction between conscious and subconscious. Right?
Yeah, well, I don't know if we're always listening. I think we're listening to it when it happens in short bursts. I think we are aware of it, but I don't think we've cracked the nut of consciousness just yet in terms of being able to say that we're listening to our subconscious. This gets us down a rabbit hole that is hard to answer. I wish I could. I do think this. People often ask, like, how do you know if you're experiencing chatter? And my answer is, you usually know it when you're experiencing it, because there's a subjective element to it, that it is so all-consuming that you're aware of it, because you can't do anything else. So I think when it takes that form, it is something that we do listen to.
Well, you give a great example in the book of the difficulty of trying to read after you get in some kind of really passionate fight with a spouse or a friend or something like that. You can try to sit down and try to force yourself to read a paragraph, but it just doesn't work because your head is consumed. That really resonated for me. Certainly, I think that happens to all of us. And the chatter comes to form our reality as well, doesn't it? You cite a study that showed that what people say to themselves is a better predictor of their happiness than what's actually happening in their lives. So I mean, this kind of internal stream is to some degree has a greater impact on our lives than the external circumstance. So if I have a more positive conversation with myself, my life will be significantly better, presumably.
Yeah, I think that's by extension, or if you're engaging in a pleasurable activity and can manage to in that moment be in the moment, you'd have a more positive experience. I think both of those are true, and I'll give you a couple of concrete examples of that. Like, I remember taking in high school. It's funny, I haven't thought about this in many decades, but it was a god-awful class, just terribly boring. And I remember I would before class, I would think about what I was going to think about when I went into class. I would just fantasize in class. And that made the class experience. I had a great time when I was there, right? Because I was transporting myself somewhere else. And it was my thoughts that were determining how I felt, not the actual experience of being in that class. And so that would be the counterpoint. I think that's the proof of what you're saying. If your self-talk, if you can make it positive, it can make dulled experiences a little bit more lively.
Well, Ethan, thank you for giving me permission to talk to myself using my own name. As it happens, I've slid into this in my midlife. And at times I feel a little like Robinson Crusoe, walking around my island. Rufus, you really need to start flossing twice a day. And I'm happy to hear that it has an official name, Distant Self-Talk. Does this really work, do you think?
I do. I've been studying distancing tools for a long time. I started doing it in graduate school. And the idea behind studying distancing was simple. If what chatter does is zoom us in on a problem really tightly, so tunnel vision, all we could think about is this thing that's bothering us to the exclusion of everything else going on in our lives and different interpretations, then being able to step back and see the bigger picture to distance should be useful. I've been studying, there are lots of ways you can distance, but I think language is a particularly efficient tool for doing it. If you think about words, we like names, right? Which is what distant self-talk is about. When we use our name and second and third person pronouns to refer to ourselves, those are parts of speech that we almost exclusively use when we think about and refer to other people. And so it's almost as though, as a species, we've stumbled on this mental hack, which is during times of stress, let me use my own name to talk to myself. It's a way of shifting my perspective, like I'm giving someone else advice. And the research shows that can be useful in a variety of ways, from helping people perform better under stress, to feeling better, to thinking more wisely. So, it works. And it's a testament to the power of language to effortlessly shift our perspective.
And I wonder, why is it that we're so much nicer generally and more balanced and thoughtful when we're talking to other people rather than ourselves? I wonder why that is.
Well, I think it's a great question. I don't have all the answers. I'll just say that. But there are I think social norms that dictate that we're not ugly with other people. I don't know that we have the same social norms, or the same norms don't apply to ourselves, right? There are lots of sayings that capture that. We are our own worst enemy. We are often much tougher on ourselves than we are against others. And I think the idea of self-compassion in part, comes out of this tradition that maybe we can benefit by treating ourselves more similar to how we might treat other people. It is interesting, though, when we look at the content of people's thoughts when they engage in distant self-talk. So we look at what do they actually say to themselves when they're talking to themselves using their own name. It's not always like cupcakes and warm cups of tea, the equivalent, like the tone of the language. It's not, don't worry, it'll be fine, and you'll take a bath and feel better. It's often quite stern, actually. It's like I often think it's like my wrestling coach is coming out to give it to me straight, and he's coaching me and he's supportive, but there's a firmness to it, at least when I do. Yeah. And I rely on this technique quite a bit. Come on, Ethan, get your act together. Stop messing around. Sit down and do your work. That is, there's love there and support, but I wouldn't describe it as ultra warm. So I think it is very interesting to think about, though, this question you're raising about why that's not our default. And if you put me on the spot, I'd probably say that there's probably some value. There's probably some value in being able to be tough with yourself at times.
Yeah, sure. Well, and also there may be value to erring on the side of generosity in our interpretations of other people's actions and behaviors from a social perspective, right? Whereas, being hard on yourself might be more likely to generate change, but not too hard on ourselves, as you point out. And I love that Dan Harris says that the inner voice in his head is an asshole. I think is his technical term for it. An asshole that speaks really, really, really fast. And, just take a step back. Most of your book is really about how we can get the inner voice in our heads to be more helpful and less of an asshole. How big a problem do you think this is for people? Do you get the sense that a large portion of our fellow humans are really struggling with negative self-talk?
At one point, the title for the chapter where I talk about the dark side of the inner voice was called "The Big Problem." We changed that. So, but that I think should capture what I think about this. I think this is, to put a dollar on the dollar amount, this is a multi-trillion-dollar problem, and that it really is not an exaggeration. So let me break it down. When this inner voice turns into chatter and we start spinning and ruminating and worrying, that affects three areas of our life that I think are central to our experience of this world. Number one, it impacts our performance and our ability to concentrate, right? So if we are consumed with chatter, as you said before, you can't read. It's not just reading. You can't do your job. And whether that job is pitching for a Major League Baseball team, as I talk about in the book, or crunching the numbers as an accountant or data analyst, right? Like, we only have so much ability to focus at any given time. And if all of that mental hardware or software, I should say, is devoted to chatter, there's not much left over. So people have put a price tag on the mental health impairments at work. Like, what is the value? Billions and trillions of dollars. Then let's go to our social relationships. One other thing we know is that when people experience chatter, it often causes friction in their relationships, and it does so through a variety of pathways. One thing that happens is we often feel compelled to talk about what's bothering us with other people because we want their help. But we often keep talking about it over and over and over and over again. We talk over our friends and loved ones, and that can push them away. We're often also sitting at the dinner table with our friends and loved ones, and they're sharing things about their lives with us, that they want to just connect with us, but we're in our own head and we're not listening. I've had the experience of my 6-year-old daughter talking to me about her day with glee. Daddy, this is what happened today with Cora on the playground and this and that. And she gets to the end and, oh, so what did you do today, sweet? And I just missed it, right? So, that doesn't happen a lot, but that's another way that chatter can impact our relationships. Then you go to our health, our physical health, right? People often say stress kills. That's not exactly true. Stress on its own is a really good thing, right? The ability to quickly respond to a threatening situation. What makes stress harmful in a physical sense is when our stress response goes up and then remains chronically activated over time. That's what exerts a wear and tear on our body that predicts things like cardiovascular disease, some forms of cancer, and so forth. And chatter is in part what allows those stress reactions to persist, because we experience a stressor, we're insulted, we're rejected, we're pissed off, but then we use our mind and language to replay those stressors over and over and over and over again in our head. We don't sleep. So work, relationships, health. It doesn't get much bigger than that as far as I'm concerned.
That's pretty. Yeah, no, those consequences are pretty dire. I mean, if you allow the broken record to continue looping, right, you're killing your productivity, you're alienating friends and family, and you're submitting yourself to chronic stress. You referred to this. You made reference to the major league pitcher. I think it was Rick Ankiel, who was this unbelievably talented pitcher whose accuracy all of a sudden just collapsed, right? What happened there?
So this is, it's funny, when I started working on chatter, this is the subconscious at work. I'm a sports enthusiast, and when you're writing a book, you look for stories to bring the science to mind, to life, and my inner voice perked up here. This is a sign of it working really well. I was like, Rick Ankiel, and Rick and who? And I just had a memory of it. And then I went and I found his biography, and it was true to my subconscious. It's all about the inner voice running amok. So this guy was, the prediction was that he was going to be the next, one of the greatest pitchers of all time. Not just a great pitcher, like one of the greatest ever. And throughout his first season in the majors, he was living up to those expectations, like a Cy Young quality level pitching. And then he got into the playoffs and he threw one bad pitch. And that for people who are watching and listening who don't watch baseball, bad pitches happen to everyone on occasion, right? It happens. But something clicked in his head. It's like the one bad pitch activated his inner voice, and it then led him to hyper focus on what he was doing, which led his pitching career to totally unravel. And so the way that works is this. When you develop a habit, like the ability to throw a 100-mile-per-hour fastball or killer curveball, this is an incredibly complicated behavior that you string together through lots and lots of practice, right? Stand here, hold the ball this way, put your weight in your body this way, step back. I mean, there are probably like 50, 60 individual steps involved in a pitching motion. And they get linked together, and then they get activated automatically. So you're not thinking about it. It's impossible to think about every step in the motion before every pitch. What his inner voice did to him is, because he got so anxious, he then started hyper-focusing on the problem. What's wrong with my pitching? So he starts thinking about his windup, where his weight is, the angle that he's releasing the ball. And as a consequence, he keeps on throwing wild pitches, one after another after another. And so this, for Rick Ankiel, became such a problem that it ended his career as a pitcher, right? Because every time he stepped on the mound, his inner voice perked up, and it was the harmful side of the inner voice. It was the chatter. And it focused him in on the pitching windup, and that was it for him.
And then, but it ends better, right? He then ends up figuring it out, and he ends up an outfielder, I think, right?
Yeah, so it's a bittersweet story. On the one hand, he never did come back as a pitcher. which is quite tragic when you think about how much time he spent practicing to be a pitcher. But he does manage to reinvent himself. Several years later, he goes into the minor leagues, and he reinvents himself as an outfielder and ends up becoming an all-star outfielder. And so there is there's a nice ending to that story. But I think it provides us with a warning for what can happen if chatter strikes at inopportune times, like before a big speech you have to give or a big event. Sure. And so I think there's an important lesson there we can learn from.
Yeah. Well, and it also strikes me that there's something specific about sports and, bodily actions that make narration and the solution of words less effective. So, I mean, I have you ever read a book or heard of a book called The Inner Game of Tennis?
I've heard of it. I haven't read the book, but I know the impact that it's had on
it's a cult. Coaching. It's a cult. I mean, it was wildly popular. Published in 1972. It's really a work of psychology. It was written by a tennis coach. It's very much about the inner voice and its impact on sports performance. I think you'd enjoy it. The author Tim Galloway later became a sports and business consultant. But reading that book, I read that book working on my tennis game, and it caused me to realize that you're working on a forehand or a serve or whatever in tennis. And as you say, there are hundreds of motions involved in a single tennis stroke, and just these minute calculations of exactly when to shift a muscle, one of hundreds of muscles in your hand ever so slightly, is just wildly complicated. It's really more of a visual language in the sense that you can imitate it's almost easier to imitate what somebody else does and then focus on the feeling of that stroke than it is to try to put it into words. And when your analytical mind comes in and starts ambushing you with chatter about individual instructions, it just can completely sabotage your ability to execute. Do you think there might be something kind of specific to sports that makes this even more problematic?
Well, I think it's certainly relevant in sports for exactly the reasons you're describing. You're describing knowledge that we call as implicit. It's known and understood without you having to consciously reflect on it. And what the inner voice is doing is taking something that's implicit and automatic and trying to make it not automatic and conscious. That's not what you want to do when you're in the middle of a tennis game. You do want to do that when you're practicing. If your swing is off, right? You may want to get in there and intervene with it, but not in the heat of the moment. Sports are interesting to me because they're a high stakes event. They're often high stakes. There's performance. You're doing in front of other people. There's a lot on the line. And you interestingly see athletes stumbling on lots of chatter fighting tools on their own. So as one example, I spent some time in the book talking about rituals. Rituals are incredibly common in sports. I mean, watch a basketball game and see what athletes do when they go up to the free throw line before a free throw. Everyone has their own little, twist the ball 3 times, bounce it twice, shoot, right? Or tennis, Nadal's famous for his rituals, tug on his earlobe, pull his shorts out of his butt, curl his hair, serve.
Can you tell us about distancing? It sounds like a really helpful tool. And I think you say that it was cutting edge for a while and then fell out of favor. What happened?
Yeah, so for the concept of distancing is not new. It stretches back to ancient Eastern and Western philosophy, where you had people talk about the ability to distance or detach oneself to adopt a more objective standpoint. And Tim Beck, actually, one of the founders of cognitive therapy in the 70s, wrote that distancing was one of the key features that explained how you can help clients who are struggling with mood disorders get through their problems, this ability to stand back and weigh in more objectively on a problem. It then fell out of favor in part because the concept of distancing became synonymous with avoidance. Avoidance being let me try not to think about my emotions at all or not feel anything. And we know from lots and lots of work that when you're experiencing chatter or intense emotions, trying to avoid them and not feel anything is not a good thing. At best, it provides a short-term fix. So if you're able to temporarily avoid your emotions, you feel better. But then the emotions come pouring back if you haven't dealt with the source of the problem. So the real world example of that is if you're dumped by someone, in a serious relationship, you're ruminating about it. You go to a movie, if it's a great movie and manages to get your mind off the problem, you feel better momentarily, but then the movie ends and all the emotions come back when you're reminded of the experience. So avoidance is bad. The point that I think is important to emphasize is that distance doesn't mean avoidance. So in our studies, we often tell people to take a step back and try to think about their experience from an observer perspective. So how might my wife weigh in on this situation? Or Ethan, what are you going to do about this? Or let me visualize the event in my head and see myself in the event. In all of those cases, people are stepping back, they're distancing, but they're then diving into the experience to make sense of it. And they're still feeling negative emotion. They're just doing it at a slightly lower level of volume, right? It's just not quite as intense. And by turning down the volume a little bit, by stepping back a little bit, we find that actually helps people move forward. So in some ways, I think the concept of distancing has now come full circle. It doesn't have to be avoidant, and it often isn't.
And some of your research has provided evidence that it can be effective. I mean, you're making distancing sexy again.
That's the title for the next paper, I guess. We haven't framed it that way, but yeah, I think there's a lot of you actually see elements of distancing in many different more novel psychotherapeutic treatments, like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and acceptance commitment theory have distancing elements to it. And so I think there's a convergence of evidence suggesting that distancing, when done right, can be really useful. It's like when a friend comes to you with a problem that they're ruminating about and can't see the solution to the problem. You've got distance from the problem. It's not happening to you. You can weigh in more effectively. That doesn't mean that when your son comes to you with when your son was affected by something at school, that you don't feel emotion when thinking about the situation. Like when my daughter has a tiff with someone, I get upset, but I can still counsel her because I have a little bit more space. And what's fascinating to me about we human beings is that we have evolved the ability to gain distance from our own experiences through lots of different tools that I talk about in the book, and that we often spontaneously use those tools when we need them. So why does LeBron James spontaneously engage in distant self-talk when he's under stress? Why does Jennifer Lawrence, when she's in the middle of an interview and getting flustered, stop during the interview and say, "Okay, Jennifer, get a hold of yourself"? Who taught her to do that? We've stumbled on these techniques, and I think what the science has done is clarified how they work, which then licenses us, I think, to use them.
Yep. And journaling is something else that's quite in vogue, and it's really kind of a form of distancing, effectively.
Yeah, I think journaling can be very helpful, and one of the ways that it can be helpful is like when you're journaling about yourself, when you're writing a story about yourself, you become a character in that story. You're writing about you. And we've done some work which shows that can have a distancing quality that predicts people feeling better.
I love this this incredible letter that you have in the book that Fred Rogers, better known as Mr. Rogers, writes to himself. Right, it's an extraordinary artifact. He says, I'll quote just small pieces of it. He says, "Am I kidding myself that I'm able to?" By the way, to back up for a second, Mr. Rogers, for anybody who's, over 35 or something, extremely well, but was just this sort of legendary, extraordinary man who was incredibly productive for decades. So he comes back to work and he writes down on a piece of paper, "Am I kidding myself that I'm able to write a script? I wonder if every creative artist goes through the tortures of the damned trying to create Oh, well, the hour cometh, and now is when I've got to do it. Get to it, Fred. Get to it. It seems kind of funny to write something like that down on a piece of paper. What can we learn from this?
Well, I mean, it's remarkable in the sense of it's like a chatter artifact, right? I mean, what's amazing to me about that experience is it sure seems like this guy is consumed with chatter, imposterism. I'm a fraud. How am I going to manage? And then at one point something clicks, and he just switches into now coaching himself like it's like he's had enough with the chatter, and he's saying, you know what? All right, here's what I would tell someone else: just do it, Fred. Get up, stop complaining, and start doing it. And this is the same thing that you see in a LeBron James quote that anecdote I provide in the book, when he's trying to figure out where to when he becomes a free agent, what team should he play for. He says, the one thing I didn't want to do is make an emotional decision. And then the moment he utters that goal, he says, all right, LeBron James, you got to do what's best for LeBron James. It's the same thing that Malawi Yousafzai, that example we started with.
Yep.
It's the same exact thing she does. She starts off in the first person. What would I do if the Taliban comes? Okay, Malawi, take a shoe and hit him. It's what I did when I was at my wit's end with that threatening letter. And at some point I said, when I started thinking crazy thoughts like, do bodyguards exist for academics, right? Ethan, get a hold of yourself. This is nutty. You're acting crazy. And so here's what we don't yet know, which I find such an interesting question. What is it inside us that cues us at a certain point to spontaneously shift from I to using our name, from being in an immersed chatter mode to distancing like that? That is such an interesting question to me, and we're trying to get at that in the lab. We don't have the answers yet. But what we do know is that when you use your name, it can help. And so I think that's empowering knowledge, because it means you don't have to wait to stumble on this tool, which may or may not be in your repertoire for managing your mind. You can do it proactively, and which is, one of the things that I do when I'm getting worried or anxious about something. I'll just, all right, Ethan, what are we going to do? So I'm very deliberate about using that tool now based on the work we've done.
It's interesting because I have been addressing myself by name more and more in the last, 5 to 10 years. And I thought it was just a sign of like, midlife insanity or something like that. So I'm really very reassured by this. Maybe I was unwittingly figuring something out. Another way of using distance self-talk is with what you call the universal you. How does that work?
So there are what we're learning is that there are many ways you can use language to gain distance from your experiences. Distance self-talk, using your name, that's just one. The universal you is another. And the universal you, right now, for people who are listening and watching and who haven't read the book, what the hell is the universal you? I'm going to give you the experience. And once you have the experience of seeing it in action, it's hard not to see it everywhere. So here's the example. Sheryl Sandberg, Facebook exec, tragic experience occurs to her several years ago. Her husband dies when they're on vacation. Tragically falls off the treadmill, has a heart attack. Awful story. She goes into mourning, and when she comes out of mourning, she writes a post to her Facebook page in which she describes her emotions like a journaling exercise. And at one point, she says something along the following lines. When you lose someone you love, you don't know what to do. Your heart just leaves your body. You don't know how to cope. And she does something there that if you're not paying attention, it doesn't even register. But she's doing something actually that seemed on the surface very odd. She's talking about her own incredibly personal experience, the loss of her husband. But she's using a word, you, that we typically use to refer to other people. She's not saying, when I lost my husband, my heart left my body. I didn't know what to do. She's saying, effectively, when she's using the word you to describe her experience, she's saying the equivalent of, if anyone loses her husband, anyone would react this way. Anyone would have this experience. And so the universal you is a tool that people use to talk about painful experiences in general terms. This is not about me. This is about how the universe works. And the ability to do that has two important benefits. Number one, it distances us a little bit from our experience, which gives us the mental space to work through it more objectively. But it normalizes our experience. It's not just me who would feel this way. Anyone would feel this way. So if I'm rejected from an editor or a publishing house, right? Yeah. It's not, oh, I feel so, I was just rejected. What am I going to do? It's, what are you going to do when you're rejected? How are you going to feel? It's like anyone would have this reaction. And the ability to normalize an experience, I think, is powerful, right? There's a power that comes, an emotional benefit that comes from knowing that what we're experiencing is not just about us. This is about how the world works. It's about how the universe works. And that's what this one word can do for us, which I think is, again, a testament to the power of language to shift our perspectives relatively effortlessly.
One of the things I find so fascinating about some of these subtle linguistic distinctions is that it gets back to this idea that we think we live in a universe of words, in the sense that we live in our brains and think in words. And these just subtle adjustments to our word choices have this profound impact on kind of our life experience. I think it's extraordinary. Two of the most surprising studies in the book showed that after traumatic events, like specifically 9/11, survivors who shared their painful emotions with others did worse over time than people who kept their feelings to themselves. Do I have that right?
Yeah, there's research in the book that I talk about which shows that sharing emotions sometimes makes things worse or has no beneficial effect at all. And, it speaks to, I think, a very important topic, which is other people and the role that they play in helping us manage our chatter or not. And, in popular culture, there's this very strong idea that when we experience strong emotions, we should just vent those feelings, express them, get it out. We hear this all the time now with coronavirus, too, in the pandemic. Just find people to connect with and share. The science shows that it's not as simple as just finding people to talk to. Other people can be an incredibly powerful tool for helping us manage our chatter, but they can also be a vulnerability. And so, one of the things I tried to do in the book was really bring the science to bear to explain how talking goes right and how it can go wrong. The important things to keep in mind are that there are essentially two things we're looking for when we go to other people for support with our chatter. One is empathy and connection. Like, there's value which comes from the fact that there's someone else I can share my experience with that is willing to listen to me and show they care. There's a strong connection that's formed, and that feels really good. And when I share what happened to me, in a bad event with you, let's say, Rufus, who I'm going to do this more often, given you've given me the invitation now.
Absolutely.
Like, that's great. We feel connected and close. Good thing. But in and of itself, that doesn't do anything to help me with the chatter, right? Just because I feel connected to you doesn't help me reframe the experience, get a different view on the event, right? Make sense of what's bothering me in ways that allow me to button the problem up and move on with my life. Other people can help us do that second thing, but what's required there is for that other person to help broaden our perspective. So if you come to me with a problem, I ask you about the problem, you tell me about it, we talk about your emotions, but then at some point, when the timing is right, you know what, Rufus, that sounds like a terrible experience you had during the podcast interview. But you've interviewed a lot of people at this point, right? So you've had other experiences, and how did you deal with those? You got over them. Or I might say, oh God, I've had experiences like that, and here's what I've done to deal with these kinds of situations. So there are ways we can nudge those we're talking to help them see the bigger picture, to broaden their perspective. And the best kinds of support are ones that do both of these things. The person you're talking to not only gives us empathy, shows they care, but also helps broaden our perspective. And simply venting doesn't do that, and it's why it can get us in trouble.
This goes against so much conventional wisdom. I think it's so interesting. You talk about the hydraulic model of emotion. I love this term. And the idea here, I think, is that we need to release our strong emotions like steam to relieve pressure. But this model is misleading. And this goes all the way back, I think, to Aristotle, right, who talked about catharting one's emotions. And then subsequently, obviously, Freud most famously put this forth.
Yeah. It's a great model. It's a great story. It's wonderful. It's just not true. It doesn't capture human experience. Instead of a hydraulic model, what we've learned is that the mind, instead, when it comes to emotion, there's a principle called accessibility that describes how the mind works. And you could think about it as like playing a game of dominoes, where one negative thought activates another negative thought, which activates another negative thought, right? That's how the mind works. So when I'm unloading how I feel to you, I'm not just letting it all out. I'm actually keeping the negative flame alive. And so, there are studies which show that when we get into what we might call, the technical term for one of these venting sessions is called a co-rumination session. So you're asking me how I felt. You're telling me you felt the same way, and we just go back and forth. You and I, our friendship gets better. We feel a really tight connection.
Yep.
But what happens is the negative problem stays active. The negative feeling stays active. So you feel like, yeah, I got a buddy, but you hang up the phone and you don't feel better about the situation. You feel worse. And there are longitudinal studies which show that when the more likely you are to co-ruminate about something, that predicts like worse feelings over time, more depression, more anxiety. So it's a tricky thing, because on the one hand, we do want to connect with someone else and share. But at some point, we need to stop sharing and start problem solving. And I think knowing about how these exchanges work, on the one hand, for the person seeking support, it can be empowering, because I know now I'm very deliberate about who I seek support from. Like people who are really helpful, who show that they care, but help me put my experiences in perspective. I don't go to friends and family who just get me to rehash what happened and validate my feelings. Like that alone doesn't make me feel better. So there's an important take home, I think, for the person seeking support, but there's also an important take home for the person providing support, right? The science can help us become better advisors to others.
I have always heard that, people don't actually want advice. They want you just to actively listen and empathize. I had a wonderful conversation last year with a woman named Kate Murphy, who wrote a fantastic book called You're Not Listening, which was another Next Big Idea Club selection. And it's about the power of listening for both the listener and the listenee, I guess you could call him or her. My conclusion, and wonderful book, so much wisdom and insight in that book. My conclusion coming out of it was that I should try to subdue my impulse to give advice, which I often have, unless I'm specifically asked for it. But you land in a different place, and I think that it's. I think your conclusion is intriguingly kind of divergent from the cultural moment. I would say, and I'm interested to hear what you think about this. I mean, I think there's an argument that in this cultural moment, we're erring on the side of co-rumination, right? That the most important thing is validating everybody's experience and deep empathy. And you seem to be saying that it's also important to help people put things in perspective.
I think it is important to put things into perspective. I think you want to do both. You do want to validate. Empathy is a great thing, right? We want to be empathic with one another, but when we find the conversation is just spilling into these thought loops, like the external manifestation of chatter, we don't want to reinforce those. I do agree, though, that there's an art to doing this, and there's a time and a place to provide the perspective broadening advice. I don't think you want to do it unless you are asked for support. And I think people often come to us, hey, can you help me work through this problem? That's the time to do both the empathy and the perspective broadening. In cases where you are not explicitly asked for advice, I think there are dangers, and there are documented dangers in doling it out. And so that's when I think, what would the science say about those times? That's when you want to help invisibly, invisible forms of support. So doing things like, if I'm seeing my wife really struggling, with work and kids and other stuff, there are ways I can try to help alleviate her chatter without drawing a spotlight to the fact that she's struggling, because that could make us feel inadequate. If someone volunteers the advice, like, and so, like doing things as simple as like taking care of dinner, or the dry cleaning to ease her burden, like that can be helpful. Or if like a student of mine is really struggling with a problem, they haven't asked for help, and I don't want to make them feel insecure. Maybe I suggest that, hey, there's this talk on campus, let's go listen to it. This seems really interesting and relevant to all of us. Or, we read a paper, a journal club that relates to things. Like, those are ways of getting the person information, but without shining a spotlight on the fact that they need our help.
The invisible support was my favorite piece of marital advice in the book. and I think there's a slight risk that the invisible support might not be detected at all, but hopefully not. Well, I think it's a great insight. Do you think there's some forms of self-help and even talk therapy that might be on the wrong side of this co-rumination trap?
Yes. Yes. I think that not all forms of self-help and therapy are on the wrong side, but I think there are many that are, and I think it's understandable why, because it feels so good to connect with someone else, which we know venting does. That feeling of connection that we establish, that bond and friendship, right? That can lead us to lose sight of the fact that there are additional things that we need to do to get through this chatter. And I think that this is where the science is so useful, right? Because there are studies which have looked at this time and time again and shown that the co-rumination doesn't help. It predicts bad things. And so I think, our intuitions are often correct about what'll make us feel better, but they're not always correct. And for people who might be wondering about, well, but it feels so good to share our emotions with others. Like, there are lots of things that feel really good in the moment that aren't good for us over time, right? Like, lots of behaviors that have short-term bursts of positivity, but don't actually help us and can harm us. And I think co-rumination is one example of that.
I like your comment that we need to be a little bit Kirk and a little bit Spock, which is from the Star Trek School of Psychology, apparently. How does that work? How do we balance the Kirk and the Spock?
Well, I think, Kirk is, if you think about it, it can be the manifestation of empathy and emotion, right? It's just, talk to me, let me hear it, I'm here for you. And Spock is the emotion-free, rational, well, here's what you need to do. This is the rational way of managing the situation. So I think as a chatter advisor or support provider, we want to blend those qualities. We want to have the empathy of a Kirk, but the objectivity and reason of a Spock. And there's an art to doing that. So, writing this chapter in the book was challenging because, early readers wanted clear prescriptions, clear take-homes. Okay, I want to know how many seconds in a conversation we should spend rehashing, and then tell me exactly when we should switch into advice mode. I've read every article I could find on this stuff. I cannot tell you. There's an art to it because every person is a little bit different. Some people need a little bit more time with Kirk before Spock comes into the picture. Other people less. And I think that's where the art of being a good advisor to others comes into play.
And as it happens, we learn in the book that that this art of being a great counselor, some of it was captured by the FBI in their hostage negotiations research, and they developed something called the behavioral change stairway model,
Yeah.
which I found fascinating. And I love the idea that when friends and family need our support, we can think of them as bank robbers who first need to be empathized with, right? And that's sort of like empathy comes first, calmed, and then over time reasoned with, right? So maybe
Well,
we're all bank robbers at moments.
there's
But
a continuum.
it was quite rational.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think, we often stumble on solutions and then we do the science after the fact to make sense of how they work and to try to really sharpen our distinctions. And I think this is a great example of this, the folks who stumbled on how do you negotiate with bank robbers and terrorists effectively. And they stumbled onto this idea that initially you've got to provide the kind of listening and empathy. And then once the person feels validated, right? And over time that happens, that's when you can get in with the problem solving mode. A similar dynamic characterizes how we deal with, the much more minor tiffs that we experience in our lives.
I love your insight that we can all benefit from a chatter board of advisors. And I guess part of the logic here is that you may know that you have some wonderful friends who are co-ruminators, right? Who are going to be, you're going to have an incredible bonding experience. You can go through this venting process. But maybe you have some other friends who are going to be more incisive depending on the subject matter. Is that how you think about the chatter board of advisors?
Yeah, that there are certain people who are really good at blending Kirk and Spock. Certain people who have an affinity for being empathic, but also helping you work through the situation. And there are some people in my life who I care a lot about who fit that description, and I'll go to them reliably for chatter that I'm experiencing. And they're different people depending on whether it's personal relationship chatter as opposed to work related chatter. 3 people for the personal stuff, 4 for the work stuff, and I make use of that resource. There are other people in my life who love me very much and who I love very much, who I do not go to about my chatter because I know it doesn't help. It just makes it worse because it leads to this kind of co-rumination. It's not constructive. And so the advice is to be very deliberate about who you seek support from, because I think it can make a big difference.
Among the many great stories in your book, Ethan, the It Gets Better campaign started by Dan Savage is maybe the most inspirational story for me. Do you want to share that one?
Yeah. So, one of the ideas about a good support, what a good support chatter advisor does is help us see the big picture when we're struggling. Because when we're immersed in chatter, we often can't see the bigger picture and gets us in trouble, as we've been talking about. And so Dan Savage is a journalist, and he comes across these really disturbing cases of gay teens who are committing suicide. And the idea comes that, like, I wish I could just tell that person that it gets better. And he himself is gay and has lived through the difficulties of dealing with that identity, but things do get better for him. And so he actually starts a movement using the internet and social media to deliver this message where people can get on there and write notes about how things get better. And it ends up becoming viral and an inspirational movement that helps lots and lots of young people who are struggling realize that there's a lot more to it than they're experiencing right now. And so I think it's a wonderful illustration of both the value that perspective broadening, that helping other people see the big picture can have, but it's also a reminder that social media can be an incredible tool for helping people when they're dealing with chatter. It's so easy to think that social media is this evil technology that only makes us feel worse. And yes, there are ways that interacting with social media can stoke our chatter. But if used the right way, it can also be an amazing tool. And I think that story embodies that.
Well, as a tennis fan, I love the Rafa Nadal example. he used to have long hair, of course, in his earlier days. And to this day, even though he now has short hair, he does this motion of putting the strands of his hair behind each ear. He's like ordering non-existent hair, and then doing and pulling his shorts from his backside, which I'm not sure you referenced that in the book. But it's fascinating that a lot of top players do these highly ritualized moves, right? Like Roger Federer will always bounce the ball with the strings and then with the side of the racket and then with the strings. And it's precisely the same one every single time. Lots of top players do these highly ritualized moves, and you say there's a logic behind it.
Yeah, I think I had so much fun researching this material for the book.
Yeah,
rituals are like they're like a chatter cocktail. They help us manage our chatter through a variety of different pathways. One of the things they do is they help us they help us reestablish this sense of order when we feel order lacking in our head. So it's often the case that when we're experiencing chatter, we feel like we're not in control of our thoughts. They're controlling us. And one of the things we've learned is that you can regain a sense of order and control by ordering your spaces around you. So, anecdote from my life, when I was writing the book and was struggling to get a paragraph or sentence out or worried about a deadline, I'd find myself going over to the kitchen and doing something very out of character for me, which is cleaning it up. And so I clean all the pots and put them away neatly and scrub down the island. And, I joke that my wife, I think, used to wanted me to experience more chatter because the kitchen was never so clean. But this was something that I just naturally did, and it helped me feel better. Putting things in order helped me feel like I had more control. And that's one of the reasons we think rituals help athletes. Like, rituals are highly structured routines, right? We do them the exact same way each time. And that's a way we can give our sense of self of order and control. They also do other things, of course, like rituals they're often linked with meaning. They often have cultural significance, though not always, which allows us to transcend the things that are bothering us by thinking about this, ginormous group or tradition that we belong to. So, rituals are commonly prescribed by cultures around the world for what you do when someone dies, like death, big source of chatter, right? Like we do remarkably different things in different traditions, but we always do rituals to deal with like death. Birthing rituals too. Birth can be a very chaotic, chatter-producing time when we have kids. There are birth rituals across different traditions. And so, I think in popular culture, we often think about rituals as being synonymous with obsessive-compulsive disorder and a bad thing. Yes, rituals can be taken to an extreme, and like any tool, if taken to an extreme, can be harmful. But if you step back and think about it, rituals are an ancient chatter-fighting tool that have been around with us for a very long time, and the science shows they can have real value.
That's such an interesting observation that the rituals we have around birth could exist partly to help us deal with some of the challenge and trauma of the birthing process, which I've always thought of as more of a celebration. Maybe the rituals we have around birthdays might help us deal with some of the in the second half of your life, the traumatic impact of birthdays. It's interesting that rituals that we invent for ourselves would be as effective as they appear to be, right? Because it's a little like giving yourself a placebo or tricking yourself. I mean, you'd think that the fact that you're doing it would cause it to be less effective.
Well, so there is a placebo. I'm sure there's a placebo component that can add to the benefit of rituals because we know, as I talk about in the book, how powerful placebos can be. But there is research which shows that people benefit from rituals even when they don't believe in that they provide benefits. And part of the one interpretation of how that can possibly be is, goes back to the fact that you're still ordering things. You're putting things in a certain sequence. So you are experiencing the sense of control when you're engaging in a particular ritual. So So it is fascinating that you can see the benefit both with and without the belief. There is another point to keep in mind though, that I don't know of much research that's compared the like culturally transmitted rituals to the ones that people develop and invent on their own. It wouldn't surprise me if the culturally transmitted ones are more powerful, because
right.
they're connected to that broader sense of meaning, God and our group. But those studies haven't been done.
Yeah, it's like a community and ritual cocktail. Yeah, I love your observation that obsessive compulsive disorder is an extreme case of a useful human instinct for order. That we have a healthy human instinct for order that maybe can get carried away. I also found it interesting that you see conspiracy theories as an attempt to create order in a chaotic world. So for some, QAnon is easier to accept, perhaps, than the reality of a world that no one fully controls.
Yeah, there's some really interesting research here which shows that during these times of stress, when we don't have stories, when we feel like things are out of control, another way that we can compensate for that is by believing, creating these grand stories to make sense of what's happening in the world right now. And in some cases, those are diabolical forces that are, controlling the world. And so you see rises in the belief in these kinds of conspiracy theories during times of stress. Which, I think we're seeing playing out or have over the past several months, right? These are extraordinarily stressful times. And I think we are seeing a very high level of endorsement of conspiracy theories.
Well, it's nice to know that lower stress might result in an abating of conspiracy theories.
Lack of control, I should say, lack of control, which is obviously driver of stress, but like that's, we don't feel like we're in control. So let's regain a sense of order from somewhere else.
What's funny in my own life, I find that I like a combination of order mixed with a bit of chaos, right? I like to have like, books all around, not perfectly aligned. And a little bit of, I find, I've always been more of a Mac guy than a PC guy. And I think I like having a little bit of a nest of windows arranged rather than just tabs that are perfectly orderly that you click on. I wonder if there can be sometimes benefit to a little bit of chaotic stimulation as well as order.
Yeah, a previous version of the book got into some of this and how, there can be some creativity that comes from not being overly constricted. I'm like you. I'm a Mac guy too. And, if I were to turn my computer around, it looks really good in the background. I assure you. The sides, I mean, it's like ready to fall. So, here's the challenge. The challenge is to figure out what tools to use when, right? Like there's a time and a place for order. And I think it's when we feel like we are out of control. But sometimes it can be useful to just let our thoughts go wild, and we don't want to be overly constricted. And I think that's an opportunity to not have to overly, ortify your life. That's not a real word, but
this might be my favorite individual piece of advice, not just to go out into the woods or hang out at a museum, but to seek out something vast and difficult to explain. I love that. Is this about distancing effectively? Is it rendering ourselves small before the cosmos?
Yeah, I do think that there's a connection there, and I love this finding too. There's a contrast that occurs when you are when you are experiencing when you're trying to understand something that you can't understand, something vast. That's like the ultimate perspective broadener, the ultimate distancer, if you will, right? Because you're seeing like, oh my God, my problem seems so tiny when we're contemplating the universe, like or a skyscraper, or even for me, a plane flying. Like I still experience awe when I contemplate how we figured out to put people in a tin can and, shoot it up in the air and then land it. Like, I can't contemplate it. It's hard for me to do. And when, having that a feeling of awe can really just put our own problems in perspective in a very powerful way. And, it's one of these ways that we can regulate ourselves from the outside in. And I find that to be a concept that is both powerful and really fascinating. This idea that tools exist not only inside us for managing the conversations we have with ourselves, but all around us too, like in creating order in our environment, seeking out awe-inspiring experiences. Like, tools are all around. We just need to know where to look, and so that is a mind blower to me, to use a very technical term.
Yeah, yeah. I'm with you on the airplanes, Ethan. It is just astounding that works. That the whole thing works. Yeah. Well, as a psychologist, you're of course familiar with the work of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote the book Flow. And he concluded that people are at their happiest precisely when they're in a flow state, which is really when chatter is silenced, right? Mountain climbing, playing the violin. For me, it would be skiing or mountain biking through the woods. These are these serene, chatter-free zones, and it's actually interesting to think how the lengths people go to to get into these chatter-free zones. Some might say that illegal drug use and contorting themselves into crazy yoga poses would be other extreme acts. Does this overlap with the kind of awe that you're talking about? This kind of deep immersion?
I don't know that I would describe it as a state of flow per se. So, I think the state of flow that you're describing is where like our abilities and what's required of us like perfectly gel. And so we're like performing at an optimal level, but without over trying, and it time passes. This, I think, is a more reflective state when we're experiencing awe. Like when I'm gazing up at the stars at night and thinking like, are there, other life forms out there on the billions of planets? Like, how can there not be if there are that many? Like, it's this inability to process what's happening, and I think it's that inability to understand this vastness that makes us feel small. So I think it is a little bit different.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I may. Since both the skiing and mountain biking are in the beautiful outdoors in these extraordinary settings, I feel like I may get a little dollop of awe along with the flow. I get a little double whammy, but I don't know. Maybe that's how it feels.
And these things are often bundled together. These tools, like so, I think I talk about 20 or so tools in the book, but like we get awe from nature, but we also get a mental recharge when we're in a green space through other mechanisms, right? We know that sometimes, like when people are traveling in time in their heads, they're also using distant self-talk. So sometimes the tools blend together, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think in daily life we often need to use multiple tools at any given time to really feel better.
Sure. Well, and you alluded to the power of nature and kind of green space. As a city dweller, the studies you cite about the importance of green space for mental health is a bit discouraging. But at the same time, it's extraordinary, right? There was a study in Toronto that showed that having just 10 more trees on your block had a health impact equivalent to being 7 years younger or earning $10,000 more per year. Remarkable. Similar results have come out of Chicago in the UK. But we don't have to live in the woods, right? Like a little bit of green space, even looking at pictures of nature can have the same effect. Is that right?
Yeah. So there does seem to be a dose response that the more immersed you are in nature, the more benefits you derive. But we know at the bottom end of the spectrum, getting a little bit of nature is better, significantly better than getting no nature at all. And so looking at videos of green spaces or pictures, or, I've actually re-engineered my office at home so I'm facing green space. It's a wild literature. You see this over and over, these findings that more green space exposure has these mental benefits. And so, and it's a very low cost way of improving your mental lives. So I highly endorse it based on the research that's out there. And don't be afraid of the findings if you're living in the city. So.
And of course, we have houseplants.
Yes.
But it's interesting that there's data showing that people who live in cities live a little bit longer. I think right now it's about 2 years longer in the U.S. But I'm guessing that may be the walking or other, or it could be correlated with personal relationships. We know that community has a profound impact on health. I wonder how these different findings can be explained.
Yeah, well, I think, this is where the experiments are really helpful because, when you're dealing with those kinds of correlations, it's intriguing, and there are connections that are established between one thing like nature and longevity and health, but there are always other potential explanations, right? As you're describing. So that's when some of the experiments where you have people walk through a green space versus the city and the exact amount of time in each space, and you see benefits in one group for another. That's where those experiments become super valuable. And so, based on those experiments, which have linked nature with beneficial chatter reducing effects, the question would be within the city. If you look at people who have more green space exposure compared to those who have less, do you see differences in longevity? Because there's so many other factors that distinguish the city dwellers from the countryside dwellers.
That's right. And there's an astounding study, a very innovative study, right, that identified that people living in an apartment complex were profoundly impacted by what side they faced.
Yeah, this is a classic study done about 20 years ago by Francis Kuo. And, there was basically people were essentially randomly assigned to different apartments in a public housing complex in Chicago. And what they found was that the people who had views of green spaces were managing their problems and better and thinking more efficiently than the people whose windows faced cement structures and urban playgrounds. Really, really just wild. So, the take-home lesson is if you can look out onto nature or put that desk plant on your desk, go ahead and do it.
It's wonderful as a scientist when large-scale randomized controlled studies are done for you over large periods of time. It's less wonderful when you're the person who's assigned to the wrong block and don't have the positive impact of looking at it, beautiful trees. You lay out a theory that has to do with the relationship between our voluntary attention and our involuntary attention. The natural world and great music, art, you say, captures our involuntary attention because of what you call soft fascinations. I love soft fascinations. What a wonderful phrase. How does stimulating our involuntary attention quiet our chatter?
So when our voluntary attention is our ability to focus hard on something, and it's easily depleted, and it's what chatter is consuming because we're focusing on the problem over and over and over again, and there's only so much of it that we can do. And when we're over focused on the chatter, we don't have the attention left over then to think about other things like our work, our relationships. When we're walking through a green space and we're drawn naturally to this interesting foliage and shrubbery around us, that lets our attentional reserves replenish. And that's one of the reasons why we think nature can be so restorative, because it's like, putting the computer on sleep mode, if the computer is your head, letting our energy restore so that, okay, when we're done from the walk, now we can approach the problem fresh and anew.
Interesting. I like that. Well, thank you, Ethan, for taking time out of your raising of daughters and teaching of students and distant self-talk to be with us today. This was fascinating.
It was a really fun conversation. Thanks for having me.